Keith, your views on the events leading up to the election, SNC Lavalin, Judy Wilson-Raybould, must have had an effect. What's your view of the bigger arc of the Liberal trajectory?
I think it hasn't played itself out yet. I think there may well be more to come on that. But I thought they were big events. I thought that they were remarkable events in the sense that I don't remember ever seeing a leader especially do what essentially Justin Trudeau did, which was torch his own brand in the way that he did. And I think it was, honestly, I think it was a consequence of a certain ineptness in how he handled the various stages of that developing story as his story changed over and over and over again. But I also think, and I think that others who know better the caucus than I do, that it reveals something that may become important in minority government, which is an inability of the Prime Minister to really connect with the people he needs around him. I mean, he's a very personable guy. I mean, it's not that he has no people skills, but I think if you scratch the surface in Ottawa, you'll find that he doesn't have close contacts with his own caucus. And so when it came time for him to deal with the SNC Lavalin crisis for him, he really didn't have the relationships he needed to have or the reflexes that he needed to have to personalize that from within and to maintain control of his caucus. And so it was entirely in his interest to make sure that both those ministers, both those MPs stayed in his caucus. But it was not on for the caucus. And he had no influence to change their minds. And if that's going to reveal a weakness in his leadership in dealing with a new reality, which is a minority government, well, it could be that turns out to have been an instructive thing.
Keith, important point, if I can make sure I understand it. Pierre Trudeau had the three wise men, and he probably had a good relationship with Marc Lalonde, friends, intimates, comrades. But Justin Trudeau doesn't have that kind of relationship with caucus members. Is that right?
That is my understanding, that he didn't pick up the phone when he needed to pick up the phone, and try to find a way to work this out. Too much of it was learned through what he said in public to other people. Not enough of it was learned from personal contact. And I'm one of those who believes that really skilled politicians understand the power of the telephone and of first-hand contact, because caucus members can feel very, very far removed from the leadership of the party a lot of the time. And the master of this in my political experience is Brian Mulroney, who managed to keep his caucus together through what I think have been the roughest times that I've seen in politics with Meech Lake and with the GST and so many other things. Boy, did he command a lot of loyalty. Not even necessarily from the party, because we saw how the party split, but from the caucus. Yeah.
All right, well, let's get, I want to get a reaction from the actual politicians, so go.
Well, Kelly and Keith have said some really important things I want to just pick up on. Keith's last point, I think, is really important. I don't know Justin Trudeau, but I have heard from people that are involved with the government that substantially supports what Keith has just said, that while they ran a great campaign in 2015, criticism I have heard, and I think that the evidence seems to support, the circle around the Prime Minister is too small and, quite frankly, too young. Young in the sense that really good people, a lot of policy wonks, but there's more to government than just policy wonkery. How do we make this work? How does this relate even to our own core constituency? Now we're in minority government. I don't know whether I said this earlier, but there's a huge difference between minority and majority governments. And the one obvious one, it's going to sound almost insulting to people like you who know business, but minority governments are really political. They have to be. You've got to count heads. Where are we? With not just the opposition, where are we with our own gang? Two quick examples. I was first elected to a minority government in 1975 after 32 consecutive years of dynastic progressive conservative government. And people would say, well, that's going to be tough on the government. Well, maybe so, but it's also tough on the opposition. What do I mean? I remember one very warm night in June of 1976, so 12 months into that 51 Conservative, 38 New Democrats, 36 Liberal. Boy, that's a long way from a stable majority government. What happened? I can still hear the laughter in my ear. David was probably involved on the other side at the time. We put a confidence motion down, because what do you do in opposition when the government is a majority? Well, you don't really have to care if you're in opposition. It is the politics of the foregone conclusion. Stephen Lewis was the leader of the opposition. He got up and we thought, I was young, I wasn't, believe it or not, saying a lot because I was learning on the job. Oh yeah, there are enough poison pills in this confidence motion. Lewis and the NDP will never buy that. Stephen got up one more night and said, I've long thought, Mr. Speaker, that the backbone of an average Liberal has the consistency of a wet noodle, or words to that effect, and I'm going to show you what that means. I'm going to support the opposition motion of one, and one by one, we were 36 rabbits going over a hedgerow, voting against our own non-confidence motion, because we didn't want an election, and we were almost trapped into one of our own making. Fast forward to, that was the Ontario Liberals at Queen's Park in 1975. I like Joe Clark a lot. I know Joe a bit, really nice guy. I remember the election of 1979. I think the Tories were about 5 seats away from a majority. Remember that creditist gang I talked about that elected 26 in 1962? Well, in 1979, there were 6 of them still left. Were you on the Parliament Hill at that time?
That's too young for that.
All right, well, Fabien Roy, Adrien Lambert, they had been abused by those federal Liberals in Quebec for years. They were very keen to make a deal. They were, 134 and 6 gave you 140. That was your majority. For whatever reason, and Walter Baker, the government House leader, was a friend of mine. I never really had the nerve to ask him why the deal wasn't consummated. And the combination of not cementing a deal that would have given you a majority, and it was there to be had, I know this person who negotiated told me so, and then the other thing you have to worry about in minority governments, and Keith touched on this, is, so your friend McFadden, really good guy, I'm thinking about Lloyd Krause in this case, but McFadden's a really good guy. What do you mean they formed a government and David McFadden is not in it? Well, he just can't be in it. We've got too many people from Nova Scotia, blah, blah, blah. Well, he's not very happy, is our... remember Lloyd Krause? Never from a Diefenbaker veteran elected in 1957, still there in 1979. I think when the vote was called, Lloyd was sailing someplace off New Zealand or Australia. And I don't mean to pick on him, because government caucuses are usually full of some people, not full, but have a number of people who are not very happy that they're not in government, and not in cabinet. And that's what minority government is. You better hope that, and I agree with Keith, Brian Mulroney, there's never been a prime minister as good at caucus management as Mulroney. Willie King got close in his own very different kind of way, but Justin Trudeau, better on his own behalf and on behalf of his government, have agents who can do that job, because let me tell you, you can accidentally trip yourself into an election by missing those points. He has not been helped, the Prime Minister, by fate. 2 or 3, one of the most important jobs in the new environment is the government leader in the House of Commons, the House leader. I would have thought from a distance that 2 of the obvious, 3 really good candidates for that job, because it's a totally different job now than it was 3 months ago, would have been people like Ralph Goodale. Where is he after October 21st? Jim Carr, who got elected to a very interesting minority parliament in Manitoba 31 years ago, or Dominic LeBlanc. Both LeBlanc and Carr got re-elected. They both have fairly serious cancer. I suspect are not going to be able to do that job. So Trudeau now has to find somebody. Trudeau Sr. was able to do what he did in 1972, because you probably remember a Celtic wunderkind of parliamentary means from the Cape Breton region, Alan J. McEachen. McEachen was probably one of the... Bob Welch and Alan McEachen were 2 of the best House leaders that I've ever seen. And Trudeau was going to have to find somebody with some of those characteristics. The last point I want to make comes to something that Kelly said. There's a report in the news today, and I forget, one of the polling companies or somebody, Kelly, you might know this, and I've had this confirmed by some members, candidates out. They said there was a shift in the last couple of days. They could feel it. A shift in favor of the Liberals, and even Liberals were surprised. And one of the observations I wanted to make earlier, I'll make now just briefly, Ontario. By the time we get to the end of the election, and not a particularly edifying election, and something else Kelly said that I really want to underline, Jagmeet Singh did what neither of the leaders of the two big parties did. And he did it in a kind of an interesting way. He was literally attacked by people saying some rather rude things about what he wore, and I forget the other one. His answers, and I don't know Jagmeet Singh, were kind of a poetry. They were high-minded. National elections should, to some degree, especially from leaders, be about a bigger vision than how bad the other person is. And I think one of the things that people liked about Jagmeet Singh is that who would want to be encountered, who would want to meet somebody with cameras rolling saying, get rid of that turban or whatever. Well, I think I'm just speculating here, but I think what people liked about him was both the verite and the honesty of the answer, and there was good politics in that. I know you're looking incredulous, but I'm telling you, I think it's really important. If I had a piece of advice, and I'm looking at a picture of Johnny MacDonald, what about the great prime ministers, MacDonald and Laurier? They usually had something to say in a national election about the bigger picture, what we want to do together in the future. There was virtually none of that in this election, and I think that's not a good thing. But the point I want to make about Ontarians, the history of Ontario in national politics is, especially at times when there seems to be impending balkanization. And by the end of this campaign, it was pretty clear. The West, particularly the Prairie West, was angry, and Quebec, as David McFadden not only said, but the tone of his voice kind of conveyed it, there was a resurgence of a particularist, separatist Quebec. Typically, when that happens, Ontario tends to react in a way that kind of tries to offset that. I think there was some of that in the last few days, because for Liberals to get 79 of 121 seats in a national election where the Conservative Party is not like it was in the 1990s, split in two pieces, Reform and Conservative, is an unusual thing. And I looked at every single result in Ontario, and those numbers were, if you're a Liberal, you know there was a God, because I tell you, they got some better results than I think any of them expected 10 days before the election. And I think in some ways, it's what I said earlier, there is an incoherent sense in Ontarians. Westerners and some Easterners sometimes say, what is Confederation? Well, why, it's Ontario from sea to shining sea. And it's a good line. I think there's a little bit of truth in that. Ontario has very real economic and political interests in a stable federation. There were indications in this election that some very important component pieces were starting to act up and act out. Ontarians generally don't like to see that. They tend to react to kind of countervail that.
David, lots for you to react to, and I'll just do a little pre-facto defense of you. You're from Thunder Bay, lived in Calgary, lived in Ottawa, so you're not exactly the ugly Torontonian. What's that I think Sean was referring to?
No, I would never.
What's your perspective on all this?
Well, I guess a couple of things. If I go back to Keith's point about SNC Lavalin, that is sort of a bad smell that may well carry on into the next Parliament, which is unfortunate, but it may well happen. The thing to remember is the trial is coming up. There's likely to be a trial unless somehow it gets stopped, but assuming that there is a trial will happen. We know from what's in the media that if that happens, it may not look very positive. So, and it could lead to a lot of things. So, I mean, that could become a huge story, and it may not be a great political story. The other thing is, because the minority government exists now, this may well wind up in a committee somewhere. And there could be because the government will not be able to necessarily, unless the government has the support of the other opposition parties, to stop a further hearing on this. It's not a great thing to have happened, but I would watch for that one. And so I agree with you, Keith. That's one that bedeviled the campaign in some respects, and I think we may see more of it. The other thing, though, that does come through is leadership. And everybody's been talking off and on about leaders. I've had the opportunity to work with a number of leaders quite closely, Davis being one, Harris being another. I agree with the observation about Mulrooney, unbelievable. He was the most effective guy I've ever seen of maintaining loyalty within his caucus in really adverse conditions. This is going to be a proving ground for the Prime Minister now, because one of the things that was very clear, as you said, was he seems to have, I would say, an indifferent relationship, it seems, even with his members of his cabinet. Mr. Dion indicated that in the whole time he was Foreign Affairs Minister, I think he said he met with the Prime Minister once. Philpott kept saying how she was upset that she could never get to see the Prime Minister. That was Ms. Wilson-Raybould's problem, was the one time she did see the Prime Minister, he wanted to change her mind. So I think that there are some things about the style of the Prime Minister that are going to have to change. The final thing I would say, and why I really am concerned about where we go from here, is this dramatic split in the country. If you have a look at the way it breaks, from Kenora riding to Fraser Valley, virtually every riding is conservative except for some ridings in Winnipeg and an NDP outlier up in Edmonton. The rest of it's all blue. You go from Kenora east, and you got quite a muddle, a lot of red if you go by the color scheme. Certainly Quebec and Ontario, again, have essentially sustained the Liberal Party in power, particularly Ontario. The risk we have now is more than a split with the Bloc. People who are there basically for one province interest. I would be worried about the West. What I've been seeing in the media, and I don't know if the media representatives here tonight may have some other insight, but from what I've read in the paper, they say the mood today is a lot worse than it was in the 80s. And that was a real downtime for relations between the West and Central Canada. So I think this is a real concern, and this is where leadership is going to have to become very important. If the national leaders play into that and try pushing it and splitting Canadians and playing pipeline games and one thing or another, this could be a very serious situation. And so I think all of the leaders are going to have to watch what they say and how they say it and not add to this. Mr. Blanchette has been elected with the idea of playing that up, so we know where he stands, more or less. But the rest of it, I think there's a real worry here, and I hope that the Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, and the Leader of the NDP really work together to try to develop a more positive situation around the country. Otherwise, this regional split could become very vicious, in my view.
Keith, first of all, from you, is David on to something that alienation is worse than when you lived there, or have you been following?
Well, I lived in British Columbia, and I know that people in Alberta and Saskatchewan would not characterize that as living out west, but it's not here; it's there. And I think that in covering politics in Canada for a long time, 17 years or something, I know something about Western alienation. It has been a story, even if I have not lived there. It does seem to me to be different, what I'm reading now. In the early 1980s, there was an identifiable target in terms of federal government policy that enraged Albertans in particular. Then you had really strong leadership in Peter Lougheed, but he could speak like a Canadian who felt like he was being left out of his own country. And I don't find that in Jason Kenney. I find that he speaks more like an Albertan. But the other thing is that I mentioned that when I said that there was like a specific piece of policy, the National Energy Program, that enraged Albertans, you could read the legislation and understand why. Right? It's hard to look at what's happened in the oil and gas sector and trace that directly to the Trudeau government, I think. But I think more than all of that, the raising of the issue of equalization is really almost designed to set Canadians against each other. It's no longer Alberta against Ottawa. It's all us guys out here against all you takers who are getting equalization. And I find that a worrisome thing because I think Kenny sees the political advantage in it and is not afraid of that. And because he's not afraid of it, I am.
Interesting. Hard to imagine that it's worse than it was in the 80s, but Kelly,
It's different from that.
Oh, different, all right.
It's different, and I think that it's attacking something in Canada. I mean, equalization, although it's been around for a long time in the Constitution, the Harper government made significant changes to the equalization formula calculation, is my understanding. Like that wasn't the Trudeau government. That wasn't Liberals. That was Conservatives from Western Canada in power. And I'm not making claims about whether they did a good job at that or a bad job at that. I'm only saying that it's an odd thing to complain about now.